Dambash. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to everyone who are joining us today from different time zones around the world. My name is Sadar Saadi, and I am the director of the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Rojava. On behalf of the Institute and the university's community, I'm pleased to welcome you all to the inaugural lecture of the Rojava Freedom Annual Lecture Series. Today, we are honored to host Professor Noam Chomsky to inaugurate our annual lecture series. Zoom webinar was not our ideal option, and we would have loved to host Professor Chomsky this lecture and all of you on the university's campus, but the current conditions of pandemic that we are in, and as well as the border regime imposed against Rojava by the Syrian government, the Turkish government, and the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq did not allow us for an in-person inaugural lecture. However, with the new opportunities coming from these digital platforms like Zoom, we are happy to host people from all around the world, even though that I'm sure we all hate Zoom meetings by now. The Institute of Social Sciences is a center of research and graduate studies in social sciences at the University of Rojava. It started its work on October 11, 2020, and it is based in Qamishli in Rojava, or north and east of Syria. This is the first graduate institute at this university, and we intend to expand it in the coming months and years in different disciplines of social sciences and humanities. The University of Rojava itself was founded on July 4, 2016, under the circumstances of war in Syria. The co-presidents of the university will talk more about the university in their welcome message shortly, but before that, I would like to give a few online housekeeping notes. The lecture is currently live on the university's YouTube channel and Facebook page. The link that was provided, probably it has changed, so just check the live broadcast of the YouTube channel of the university. We have allocated about 20 minutes for the question and answer session after Professor Chomsky's lecture. Please write your questions in the question and answer box in the webinar room or in the comment sections of YouTube or Facebook. If you are in the webinars room, there is a simultaneous interpretation from English to Kurdish Kermanji and vice versa. Please check the interpretation section for two channels for English and Kurdish. Mr. Jalil Kaya is our interpreter today. The interpretation option, unfortunately, is not available for live broadcast on YouTube, but we will have the video of the lecture with both Kurdish Kermanji and Kurdish Sorani subtitles uploaded soon on the university's YouTube channel. Without further ado, please join me to welcome the co-presidents of the University of Rojava, Dr. Abdulillah Mustafa and Rohan Mustafa, to present their message. Please. اول سلمان کشی کلمه خو انمیوت بکه ام دنگه تنابیسن
السمينار يكمين سمينار جي ريزابوتاري صالانة ينقول قاتل قاضي كلن بكتبو خباتين دكتور سردار سعدو وفسباسياوي وكذا تجبلن وهجاكر جو أمدكرنا في سميناري وهذا سميناري ولن مجي بجوش بلند بدل الجرم متفصل براسي وأم ودعوة بك والسيمينار جسدنا السيمينار يكمل وأنا لذلك كده سدنا دوا ويجرين وبراسي بروفيسور هذا البلند بروح حسكر ودي كدو خباتن چندی سالا دواری زانستی ویژه‌ای و سیاست و هر وها دیکارندی دبو کارو خبات اینا هاتیه ناصرن لتواهی جهانی گو او به سیمینار دکم به پیشکش بکر براسی جبو مجی شهنازیه مزنه سربلاندیای مزنه جبو زنگه بو ایرو کسی و جناب پروفسور نام چومسکی بوده لیفانی زنگ همه و سیمینار یکم درجه بوداری ین سالانه جو زنگ روجاوا بوی کشیش. وقت زنگ همه روجاوا زنگ هک کرد زنگ هک کردیه حتی دام زنگ نتام شو سال 2016 بکدا ماموستیان کرمگو خبرکاری مینا هر وها کدا اندکارانجی گو براستی بگاون چوب لی بجوشک و مورالک گریک مزن بوها خواهرن و هینجی بدوام ده خباتا خدا وان بین نسلی بدست هنگو ام سپاسیا چه کسی سر کاری زنگه سکنی بگیه اونا سپاس کن دست خوشی بکارو خباتا زنگه همه برنگی کی جدا، شیوازی کی جدا، فلسفه کی جدا، جزانگی هریلی کارو خبرات فر بریبده. امان جمیناجی، امان جن فرفره مزن داینی پیشافر، امان دویجی اون، یعنی زنسته گریدای اتیاتیک، parasına Martin Sereke yin Ruman, rezitun parasına zaman çandu زمان الهرمي وكهبيا جنو إيران برنسيبين إيكولوجيك وكهبيا جوابي مروباهي وعدالة جوابي هروها قراسنا شاندو زمان الكردي إبو بدهي صلاحة قدركرن برمانجا تنكرين زانجت بدوام بدستنا أمانجوكا أول ماجي إشخصنا بالكروردهي وك أمانجك سركش خلده أباقرنا تيمك أكاديميسيان و سبروجي دارن راجن باي زانسي أكاديمي هندري بيزانجي إجبر لي أمانجي براسي مقابلي فرد از بیجم باش مدایم خیلا آبادنا انستیتوی خندنا بند ین دکاری زانست مروباهی و جواکی و ویژه و زانست تکنولوژی نوجن و شکلی آماج و داریم دستیک هاتن داریم و مجموعنا اکادمیسیون خیلی ایکوجیکی ایبو زنگها خالی قلیل کتن جزيرة مثلا هذا خمسوار لكلا داوي راسي من جوازي معابد حمو درين جهاني درياهن خبران وبيجوار جوارن كمان أكاديميين أشتي وأكاديميين وتبلي بيجوار جوتمه هيكون يسأل درباسبي ونسيكا صدو بيجي أكاديميين حمو درين دنياي آلیکاری آخر پیشوازی کردن و آمادگون آخر براستیجی جبوم دست نشان کرد. دویش هفته اکادمیسیون آزاد، اکادمیسیون دموکراسی خواز، اکادمیسیون گروه حسکر و یک جوانا جناب پروفسور نام چومسکی او بنگوازی آمد قبول کرد و أب درفت دامر و دمك جوفت إخوة جبومة بقطان جبومة جبو خندكارين بلند خطوة جباكين زانسي أدما زيرين جمالة بقطان بو أمبراسي قلتي تيكر خوش ودرشانة وقت مبود جمالة جيس بداية شهنازي رجعنا كل أصل ما نصلوا هانجي ودخين جبوجو أخذنا ويجي دبي إيش وزيرة نوم شمسي هاي أمي سوا خيرنا وتنسى ثلاثة شهور.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to Rojava University Freedom Annual Lecture Series, and a special thanks to Professor Noam Chomsky, who will inaugurate today the Rojava University Annual Lecture Series. As you know, Rojava University is founded in 2016 in the midst of extreme and rapid changes and transformation occurring in the region. Despite the hardship, lack of resources, ongoing wars, and Turkish attacks on the north and east of Syria and Rojava. So, to establish an alternative university in such circumstances is a revolution itself. With the aim of building an alternative education system, Rojava University introduces a new philosophy, opening new horizons and embedding fundamental rights, principles, as well as values into its educational system. It believes that the education system in the Middle East should be redefined because it imposes authoritarianism on society and create dogmatic beliefs. And we know the result of such dogmatic beliefs on society during this war that we are living now in it. It also adapts the principle of democratic nation, ecological society, and women liberation and equality between women and men. And we can see this principle in its system, in education and administrative system. As you know, the administrative system of Rojava University is co-presidency, a man and a woman. And it also believes in creating independent-minded people and critical thinking. From then until now, Rojava University does the best to drive the path for its development in academic and scientific aspects. One of its significant achievements was founding the Social Science Institute for Higher Education. Our main goal of this institution to provide our students opportunity to apply in higher education system and building a new perspective that meets our aim in answering and solving the society problems that we face. So, through this event, we would like to thank all professors and academics who supported the Institute and helped in the establishing process, preparing programs, and supervising. Finally, I would like to thank you again for being with us today in this special and significant event. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdulillah and Mamustar Ruhan. We are experiencing some technical difficulties with YouTube. Can you all hear me? I think the original link did not work for on YouTube. So I'm just sending the link to all the panelists and attendees. If you can share it with your friends and colleagues and those who can't find it. Here we go. Okay. So now let me introduce Professor Özlem Güner, who will introduce our speaker and moderate the question and answers part of the lecture afterward. Özlem Güner is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the College of Staten Island City University of New York, CUNY. She's a member of the Emergency Committee for Rojava in the United States, and she's also sitting on our Institute's Academic Advisory Board. Professor Güner, please.
Thank you so much, Serdar. So we are honored and humbled to have Professor Noam Chomsky to deliver the first annual Freedom Lecture at the Rojava University today. Professor Chomsky, I'm sure many of you, most of you already know, is a US-based political theorist and activist, and Institute Professor of Linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Besides being considered the founder of modern linguistics, Professor Chomsky is one of the most cited scholars in modern history and on the US foreign policy. He has received more than a dozen honorary degrees from places like the University of Chicago, University of London, Harvard University, University of Buenos Aires, Delhi University, and many others. He is a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Science, and recipient of many awards, including Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award of the American Psychological Association, the Kyoto Prize in Basic Sciences, the Helmholtz Medal, the Ben Franklin Medal in Computer and Cognitive Science, and the Dorothy Eldridge Peacemaker Award. A prolific author who has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary issues, international affairs, and foreign policy, Professor Chomsky is one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world. He has written more than 100 books, including the New York Times bestsellers Hegemony or Survival and Failed States, and other books, including Middle East Illusions, Imperial Ambitions, Interventions, Gaza in Crisis, Occupy, and the Requiem for the American Dream, the 10 Principles of Concentration of Wealth and Power. His bestseller, 9/11, is an analysis of the World Trade Center attack that, while denouncing the atrocity of the event, traces its origins to the actions and power of the United States. As this long list of books on politics and power reveal, Professor Chomsky is internationally recognized as one of the most critically engaged public intellectuals alive today. He continues to be an unapologetic critic of both American foreign policy and its ambitions for geopolitical hegemony and the neoliberal turn of global capitalism. He is also an incisive critic of the ideological role of mainstream corporate mass media, which he maintains manufactures consent toward the desirability of capitalism and the political powers supportive of it. The New York Times book review called Professor Chomsky a global phenomenon, the most widely read American voice on foreign policy on the planet. As early as 1967, he wrote about the role of intellectuals, which got published in the New York Times Review of Books. He wrote in this essay, "Intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of governments and to analyze their often hidden intentions." And he exposed the shameful policies in Vietnam and the role of intellectuals in justifying it. While the intellectuals of his time were at best silent at the atrocities taking place in Vietnam, Professor Chomsky, as a renowned scholar and a tireless activist, took the responsibility of the intellect and became a public intellectual and have stood on the side of the oppressed from Vietnam to Rojava. His acceptance to give this annual freedom lecture at Rojava University today is a clear sign of his continuous dedication to struggles of freedom. There is so much to say about the immense contributions Professor Chomsky has made, but for today's event, we especially want to acknowledge him for being an embodiment of theory and praxis of solidarity and freedom. We are honored to have you with us. Without further ado, I leave the floor to Professor Chomsky to deliver his annual lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and privilege to have been invited to deliver the inaugural lecture of the Rojava Freedom Annual Lecture Series. The achievements for freedom and justice in Rojava in the midst of indescribable horrors have been an inspiration for people committed to these values throughout the world. I would like to say a few words about what faces this sad world. We are living in a unique moment in human history, a moment of confluence of crises, each unprecedented, each extremely severe and urgent. Humans have been on Earth for several 100,000 years, until quite recently in small, scattered groups. Humans are radically different from all other species on Earth, not in physical capacities, but in their mental abilities. Among these is the ability to formulate questions, sometimes to answer them. The human species is now facing a question that has never risen before. Will the human experiment survive in any recognizable form, or are we doomed to virtual extinction along with much of the rest of life on Earth and in the near future? The question is a very realistic one, ominously so. It is impossible to overestimate its significance. The answer cannot be deferred. We will either provide a positive answer, and soon, or the game will be over. There will be nothing left to discuss. These words may sound too strong, alarmist. They are not. And the words are not just mine. They are the words of the most respected specialists on the environmental catastrophe that is taking place before our eyes. They are, for example, the words of Oxford professor of physics Raymond Pierre Humbert, a lead author of the 2018 report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the highest scientific authority on this critical issue, a report that has since been superseded by more urgent warnings. Readers of scientific journals will be aware that new findings regularly lead to more dire warnings. Pierre Humbert was writing in the most prestigious and reliable journal, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. He opens his review of existing circumstances and options by writing, "Let's get this on the table right away and without mincing words. With regard to the climate crisis, yes, it is time to panic. We are in deep trouble." He then lays out the details carefully and scrupulously, reviewing the possible technical fixes and their very serious problems, concluding that there is no plan B. We must move to zero net carbon emissions and fast. The IPCC urges that this be achieved by mid-century at the latest. These warnings are becoming more urgent. A few weeks ago, the World Meteorological Organization issued its annual report on the state of the global environment. The report warns that on our present course, we may soon reach irreversible tipping points. The result may be what they call a hothouse Earth, stabilizing at 4 to 5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, well beyond the level recognized to be cataclysmic. The study concludes that it is more urgent than ever to proceed with mitigation. The only solution is to get rid of fossil fuels in power production, industry, and transportation. You can easily see what that means for the Middle East region and other centers of fossil fuel production, deprived of their sole source of revenue and trying to survive in conditions that will be virtually unlivable in the regional hothouse. Disaster does not come in a single moment. It extends slowly and inexorably. We are seeing unmistakable changes. The past 10 years are the hottest on record, approaching ominously close to the IPCC final targets before disaster strikes. And we see many signs: long droughts, irregular monsoons, extreme and destructive weather events, rising seas, all due to accelerate on our present course. The good news is that there are feasible answers to these dire problems, with measures that are understood and that would, in fact, not only address the crisis, but would lead to a much more livable and decent world. The bad news is that the measures that are available are being implemented only in part, and that is not enough to fend off disaster. These choices are in our hands. Failure to act is to choose destruction. I opened by saying that we are meeting at a unique moment of confluence of crises. Impending environmental catastrophe is only one. Another, no less serious, is the threat of nuclear war, devastating beyond words. We have been living under this shadow since August 6th, 1945, a day etched in stark contours in my memory. The atrocities were hideous enough. No less horrifying was the realization that human intelligence had contrived the means that would surely advance to the point where self-extermination is within our grasp. And that soon happened when the United States and Russia exploded thermonuclear weapons in 1953. Those who have closely followed the record of nuclear threats must be aware that it is a near miracle that we have survived this far. Miracles are unlikely to persist. Worse still, these threats are now being escalated in full awareness of the consequences. I will return to this in a moment, but first I would like to emphasize again that these are not my personal judgments, rather those of the most highly regarded specialists. I mentioned before the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the leading journal that carefully monitors these issues. Every year in January, they make public an assessment of the world security situation. It is presented in capsule form in their doomsday clock, with the minute hand set at a certain distance from midnight. Midnight means termination. The human experiment has ended, and with it, much of life on Earth. The clock was first set in 1947, with the minute hand 7 minutes from midnight. In 1953, after the explosion of thermonuclear weapons, it reached 2 minutes to midnight. The hand has oscillated since, reflecting changes in the global security situation. A few years ago, failure to deal with the environmental crisis was added to the assessment. Every year since President Trump took office, the hand has been moved closer to midnight. 2 years ago, it reached 2 minutes to midnight for the first time since 1953. Last January, the analysts abandoned minutes. They switched to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. As in the case of the environmental crisis, here too, there are feasible means to mitigate, even to terminate, the crisis. 1 week from today, the United Nations Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons comes into force. It's been ratified by 122 nations. That does not include the nuclear powers themselves, But even among them, prominent figures have advocated this stance. In the United States, in a joint statement signed by Henry Kissinger, Reagan Secretary of State George Shultz, the Senate's leading nuclear weapons specialist Sam Nunn, and former Defense Secretary William Perry. Even short of abolition, important steps can be taken. One category is the elaborate arms control regime that has been laboriously constructed in the past 60 years. Another step is the establishment of nuclear weapon-free zones around the world. The fate of these measures tells us a great deal about the world we are now facing. Until this millennium, there was slow but significant progress in constructing an arms control regime. In the past century, this has been virtually dismantled. The destruction began with President George W. Bush, who withdrew the United States from the Nixon-Brezhnev ABM Treaty. The demolition job was completed by President Trump, who canceled the Reagan-Gorbachev INF Treaty and the Open Skies Treaty that goes back to Eisenhower, and rejected Russian requests to renew the New START Treaty. With these gone, the arms control regime collapses. It's in large part for these reasons that the doomsday clock is now set in seconds, not minutes. The second major reason is Trump's hammer blows against the environment, unique in its malevolence, though the record elsewhere is at best mixed. While dismantling the limited protections afforded by arms control, Trump has also escalated the development, he's escalated the threat of catastrophe by developing new and much more dangerous weapon systems, with the lesser powers making their own contributions to disaster. I will return in a moment to the second way to mitigate the awesome threat of nuclear weapons-free zones. The fate of these endeavors is highly instructive. First, however, a brief reflection on what is taking place before our eyes. In 4 billion years of life, one creature has developed higher intelligence of a kind that is completely lacking in the tens of billions of other species that have inhabited the planet. Today, this unique species is using its marvelous endowment to race towards species suicide while knowing full well how to avoid the catastrophe. If this is not an illustration of sheer insanity, I would like to hear a better one. It is worth contemplating. One can imagine what an extraterrestrial intelligence, if one exists, would make of this spectacle. Let's return to Earth and the second way to address the threat of nuclear war, establishment of nuclear weapons-free zones. This approach has had some success. Much of the world has indicated its abhorrence of these hideous inventions by establishing such zones. Latin America, Africa, the Pacific. There are flaws. The Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone could not go into effect because France insisted on testing nuclear weapons in its dependencies for some years. And now, because the United States maintains nuclear weapons facilities on the islands it controls. The African nuclear weapons-free zone faces a similar barrier. Britain insists on maintaining its former colonial possession, Diego Garcia, rejecting the judgment of the World Court and the United Nations General Assembly that the true sovereign is African Mauritius. Britain expelled much of the population to provide the United States with a military base, which was upgraded to accommodate nuclear weapons under President Obama. It's not mere symbolism. Diego Garcia is the major base for US bombing in Central and West Asia. It also blocks full implementation of the African nuclear weapons-free zone. Despite these flaws, the steps are important. By far the most important nuclear weapons-free zone would be in the Middle East. If established, it would eliminate what the United States, along with Israel and the Gulf states, has claimed for many years to be one of the greatest threats to world peace: Iranian nuclear weapons. Recognition of the threat is not unanimous. US intelligence has informed Congress that if Iran has plans to develop nuclear weapons, it would be part of Iran's general strategy to deter aggression from its more hostile nature, its hostile neighbors, Israel and the Gulf states, which have far more advanced military systems than Iran. But let us put disbelief aside and accept the claim that Iran's nuclear programs exist and are a leading threat to world peace. Every sane person should therefore welcome the possibility of ending the threat peacefully without criminal assassinations, sabotage, large-scale cyber war, murderous sanctions to which the world is forced to conform under US threat, and serious tensions and provocations that might lead to devastating war. War is not a remote possibility. Iran is openly under threat of attack by the United States and Israel, and if attacked, it might well retaliate with missile attacks on the world's major petroleum facilities in northeast Saudi Arabia. They are well within range. And after that, one hates to imagine. Surely putting an end to these massive crimes and horrifying possibilities would be a most welcome development if it were possible. It is possible. In fact, it is simplicity itself, and everybody knows how. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East with intensive inspections. Are such inspections reliable? We know the answer. Yes, definitely. Even US intelligence agrees that they were highly reliable before Trump withdrew from the joint agreement on nuclear weapons with Iran. Are there obstacles to establishing the zone? Not from the Arab states, which initiated the proposal decades ago and have been strenuously advocating it ever since. Not from Iran, which for years has strongly called for establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone. Not from the global South, the former non-aligned countries, G77, now over 130 countries. They too have strongly endorsed the proposal. There are no objections from Europe or Asia. One country stands in the way, the United States. Whenever the opportunity arises in an international forum, it is vetoed by Washington, most recently by President Obama. Various pretexts are offered, but the real reasons are not obscure. The United States wants to protect Israel's nuclear weapons from inspection. In fact, the United States does not even officially recognize their existence, though it is, of course, not in doubt. There's a good reason for this stance. If Washington were to recognize officially that Israel has developed nuclear weapons, US law would come into play. It bans military and economic aid to countries that develop nuclear weapons outside the framework of the international nuclear weapons regime. Arguably then, the vast flow of US aid to Israel, far beyond any parallel, would be illegal. Neither political party in the United States wants to open that door. No organized force presses the matter, which is in fact virtually undiscussable in the United States, outside of narrow arms control circles and in critical literature. The idea is not officially suppressed in a free country, but it is virtually unmentionable in respectable circles, despite its great import. These are no minor facts. Tensions in the Middle East are very real and ominous for the region and for the world. Many of the tensions arise from Iran's nuclear programs and the alleged threat they pose, an existential threat that calls for a violent reaction in the official Israeli version, often echoed in the United States. It is of considerable import, then, that there is a straightforward way to resolve the matter peaceably. This is another illustration of roads not taken, though they are wide open and well known. We are all familiar with suppression of unwelcome fact and opinion in authoritarian states. Less familiar and much more instructive is the practice in free societies. It is not done by force. I've spoken and written about these matters freely for years, but the words cannot reach more than a tiny fraction of the public. And the American public, I am sure, would be interested to know that their leaders are willing to escalate the threat of danger of major war in order to prevent any infringement of lavish aid to Washington's Israeli client. Let's turn back to policy. The Trump administration is criticized for having no coherent policies. That's not entirely true. It has forged a clear, general, global strategy. It is based on simple principles that have many precedents in the history of imperialism. One principle is to support those elements that have great wealth and power. A second principle is to crush those who are vulnerable and defenseless and therefore worthless for establishing domination and control. For the Middle East, North Africa region, that means supporting the al-Sisi dictatorship in Egypt, the family dictatorships with oil wealth, and apartheid Greater Israel, which is illegally and harshly crushing Palestinian territories. The other side of the coin is crushing Palestinians, Sahrawis, Kurds after they have outlived their usefulness, Yemenis, and other dispensable people. And it is done with extreme savagery. Take the case of Yemen, for example. The strategy means intensifying the world's worst humanitarian crisis by providing the bombs to kill and at the same time withdrawing the meager aid for starving children. And it's the same elsewhere. At the political level, the strategy includes forging an alliance of the most repressive and powerful forces. The so-called Abraham Accords raise to a formal level the tacit relations among the UAE, Israel, the Saudi client, and Bahrain, later others. Another component is establishing the alliance of Qatar and the Saudi-led coalition under the U.S. aegis. All of this establishes a firm base for U.S. power for confronting those who have not yet succumbed, crucially, Iran and its allies. The broader framework is an alliance of the most reactionary forces around the world, coordinated in Washington, includes Bolsonaro's Brazil, Modi's India, Orban's Hungary, others like them. Iran has been an enemy and the target of relentless U.S. attack since 1979, when Iranians had the temerity to free themselves from the rule of the dictator the United States had installed in 1953, overthrowing the parliamentary regime. After 1979, the U.S. turned at once to providing strong support for Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran, finally intervening directly to ensure Iran's capitulation. It then moved at once, under the first President Bush, to invite Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production, plainly a grave threat to Iran. Harsh sanctions followed, diplomatic record that I need not review, leading to Trump's efforts to strangle the Iranian economy. The reason for the relentless punishment is not the nature or the actions of the regime. The brutal clerical regime is indeed a threat to its own people, and one may think what one likes about its efforts to extend its regional influence, but the U.S. cheerfully supports far worse. The Iranian regime is intolerable because of its successful defiance of U.S. policy. I borrow the term that is used in secret internal documents. The term was first used 60 years ago to justify Washington's terrorist war against Cuba and its harsh economic blockade, still persisting in defiance of universal global condemnation, Israel alone accepted. The reason for the assault, the State Department explained, was Cuba's successful defiance of U.S. policy going back 150 years to the Monroe Doctrine, which declared Washington's right to control the hemisphere. And much the same is true of Iran. Presidential doctrines since Eisenhower have come close to asserting Washington's role to control the Middle East, particularly the oil-producing regions, taking the mantle from departing Britain. Actions have asserted that role more forcefully. The only Iranian threat that concerns Washington is the threat of deterrence. That is unacceptable to those who intend to rampage freely in the region. The United States, of course, did not invent these doctrines. They're second nature in imperial practice. The Trump strategic doctrine has been an exercise in rational imperialism, savage in its effects on the dispensable people, but that is nothing new. And it is, of course, no justification to say that we are simply carrying forward the hideous record of our predecessors. I assume that the savagery will be somewhat attenuated with Trump and his minions gone, at least temporarily, but it is likely that the essence will persist unless substantial popular pressure is mounted to force a major change of course, and that is by no means impossible. In every region of the world, very serious problems arise, often shattering in their human consequences. They all demand close attention, and whatever actions we can take to ameliorate or overcome them. Lurking in the shadows is the prospect of indescribable catastrophe, a near certainty if we do not act decisively and soon to take the steps that are necessary to avert it. That is the primary challenge of the day. It cannot be ignored or deferred. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky, for your invaluable remarks. So much for all of us to think about and follow. I think Professor Özlem Göner will moderate the question and answers part of the lecture. We have about 20 minutes, and there are some questions coming on YouTube and on other platforms. And if our attendees also would like to ask questions, they can use the Q&A box. Professor Göner, please.
Yes, Yes, there are 2 questions now. So should I raise them one by one or a couple at a time? Whatever Professor Chomsky prefers, I'll go with that option. Right now there are 2, so I'll just raise them. Question from Gülay Kılıçarslan, it's coming from the YouTube audience. I would ask Professor Chomsky to what extent he feels political developments in North and East Syria serve as a model for the region in general. And from Dilar Dirik, my question is about the possibility of revolution and the role of civil society in light of the urgent matters that you have raised. We see that US imperialism in the Middle East is increasingly resorting to soft power, presented as liberal democracy promotion, quote unquote, and supporting civil society. This affects sectors like media, including social media, education, and even women's rights and ecological activism. People increasingly speak of NGOization as an extension of Western intelligence in the global South. Since these days mark the 10th year anniversary of the Arab Spring, what do you think is the future of political action by local communities, especially for young people in places like the Middle East? Where do you locate Rojava's political aspirations in this context? So maybe we'll start with these.
Well, the problems within the Middle East are, of course, quite different from those in the liberal democracies. In the Middle East, we're just commemorating the 10th anniversary of the uprisings of the so-called Arab Spring, which began in Western Sahara, moved quickly to Tunis, to Egypt, to the rest of the region. Spectacular, significant uprising, crushed by force almost everywhere, but that doesn't mean it's ended. The seeds still exist. The movements can arise again despite very severe repression. The leading specialists on the region, people like Jubir Ashkar, Lebanese scholar at the School of Oriental and African Studies in England, have carefully reviewed these situations and do believe that the possibilities of reviving something like the Arab Spring are not slight. There have been many attempts to lead to democratization, freedom within the Arab world. They have been repeatedly crushed by force, imperial force, imposition of brutal dictatorships, but they can develop again. It's a hard struggle, but not an impossible one. In the liberal democracies, situation is quite different. As I mentioned, dissent, criticism is not put down by force. It is marginalized and suppressed. So it is everything I've just discussed, you can say to an American audience. I do so, others do so, but it reaches a very small group. It is impossible for it to enter the major newspapers or television. You can talk about it on social media, but that again goes to small and scattered groups. Here's where popular movements make a difference. Popular movements can force matters into the public arena, can compel a response. That's happened over and over. Civil rights movement, women's movement, environmental movement, anti-war movement, takes a lot of work and effort, strong barriers, but it can be done. And it can be done on these matters too. Take the very critical matter of establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That would very sharply reduce the threat of very serious war. It would permit the energy and initiatives within the region to turn to their local problems, which are severe, not devoting themselves to preparing for a major war and indeed carrying out steps leading to war, like the massive Israeli air attacks in Syria just a few days ago, constantly happening. Any of them could break out into war. But in order for a mass popular movement to develop, people have to know that it's happening. They have to know what's happening. They have to know the possibilities that exist. And that is under a tight lid. It's not impossible to break out, but it'll take a lot of effort. There's no time to review it now, but if there was, I would be happy to review the recent history of other popular movements and the kinds of barriers they've had to face to break through into general consciousness, awareness, and action. It's the same in this case. Has to be done. It should be done with international solidarity. We should remember again 10 years ago, the beginning of the Arab Spring. The actions in Egypt particularly were strongly supported in the United States and in Western Europe with demonstrations, actions in solidarity with those who were meeting in Tahrir Square. That solidarity has to be reconstructed. These are international issues that cannot be handled in a local area. And these are the efforts and goals that we have to move forward to. It's not going to be easy. It's by no means impossible.
Thank you. I'm going to raise another one that also came from the live audience. What does Professor Chomsky think that it's the most appropriate and possible methodology to adopt in order to achieve sustainable development in current Rojava? So there's one for now.
Well, Rojava is a very difficult situation. The prior problem is survival. Can it even survive under the attack of Turkish aggression opened by the United States, forming Turkey, you're free to carry out aggression. Assad's brutal regime on the other side, other hostile forces in the region. The survival of Rojava so far has been almost miraculous, and to carry it forward will be no small task. Well, beyond that, the whole region must move to sustainable energy. There is simply no alternative. Syrian oil just has to be terminated. That's, of course, a small part of Middle East oil. The major oil producers must stop producing petroleum, not in one day, but within the next few decades. They have to do it step by step, cutting back every year. By mid-century, they must stop altogether. These are not questions that are open to discussion. If they don't do it, we're finished. Okay, it's as simple as that. Quote again, the leading specialists, panic now. There is no plan B. This must be done. What can be done is to shift sustainable energy. In the Middle East region, there are many opportunities for that. There's a huge amount of sunlight. Solar power is now cheaper than fossil fuels in many areas, and it's getting much cheaper all the time. Wind power is available. In some areas, hydropower is available. Many other sources. They're within range. They have to be developed quickly. The oil-producing states, Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, 40 years ago, they knew, they understood that they have a brief period in which they can move towards a survivable future. They could use their vast oil revenues to prepare for a post-petroleum day. They wasted these 40 years. They did almost nothing to prepare for the future that it was known 40 years ago is going to come. There were warnings. Many people wrote about it. I did too, many more influential people. Here's what you have to do. Use your oil resources while you can still use them to prepare for a future without petroleum. It was wasted in ways that you know about, I don't have to review. Now they're facing the situation where they have to do it right now. If this is not going to be done, not only will the Middle East region itself will become mostly uninhabitable, literally uninhabitable. If you look at the predictions and analyses by climate scientists within the Middle East region, there are many excellent ones. They predict that the Mediterranean, on our present course, the Mediterranean during the summer will rise to the heat level of a jacuzzi. You'll barely be able to enter into it. That means all the fish will die. The sea level will be rising. The coastal plains will be inundated. The temperatures in Saudi Arabia and the desert will be completely unlivable. All of this is going to happen unless we move quickly to sustainable energy. Rojava is a very difficult situation because the problem of survival overwhelms it. But in the wealthy, powerful states, the Gulf dictatorships, it's a straightforward matter. They've wasted 40 years. If they waste the next 30 years, they're finished and we're all finished.
Thank you. There's another question from the audience about anti-imperialism. I would like to ask about anti-imperialism and solidarity, given the example of Rojava and Iranian people's revolution. How would it be possible to establish global left solidarity that does not confine itself with only the framework of anti-imperialism? If I may, this is actually a question that I have, and maybe just slightly differently phrased, and not necessarily that, but how can we rethink anti-imperialism given the fact that regional empires such as Iran and Turkey, who have historically oppressed their populations and oppressed populations such as Kurds and women, sometimes take this position of anti-imperialism when there is reactions from the left of the US, or from, if there's any sort of action by the US to stop the Turkey's air attacks from Turkey. There's this notion of, oh, imperial forces are coming in again, and there's some recognition of this among the left as well. So my question and this question, I think, are related. How can we rethink anti-imperialism so that we don't give this excuse, this discourse to the regional empires themselves? So thank you.
These are questions that arise all throughout history all over the world, and there's only one answer to them: try harder. There are no magic keys. The methods that have to be used depend on local circumstances. What you can do in the Afro-American areas in the South in the United States, there are methods you can use there. They're not the methods that you can use in Rojava. They're not the methods that can be used in India to try to overcome the destruction of secular democracy and the crushing of the Muslim population by the Modi regime. And they have their problems. They have to pick their methods. There's simply no general answers. There haven't been, and that's been true for every movement you can think of. Abolitionism, women's rights, environment. Pick the issue. You have to find the appropriate methods in the particular circumstances where you are. It would be nice to have general answers, but there simply aren't any. And it's a waste of time to look for them. You have to ask, what can I do in my immediate local circumstances to advance the cause that I'm interested in? Now, solidarity is possible, international solidarity. The example of Rojava is quite suggestive in that respect. It did, the amazing achievements there did arouse considerable sympathy in many international circles. Not enough, mainly because too few people knew about it. But in the circles where information was circulating, there was strong support, even direct participation, as you know, feeding back to the United States. This can happen. I'll give you one example, which is quite remarkable, unique in the history of imperialism, and suppressed in the United States because it's too dangerous to know. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration was carrying out a vicious, murderous, terrorist war in Central America. Hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered. Every imaginable kind of torture was taking place. Countries were devastated. The United States was even brought before the World Court and condemned for international terrorism. In the mainstream, all of this was ignored, but not among the public. For the first time in the history of imperialism, people from the imperial society, tens of thousands of them, not only protested, but went to live with the victims, to try to help the victims who were being destroyed by state terror, even to provide them with whatever protection you get from a white face, which is not small. And they lived there, they stayed there, they worked, some got killed, some suffered. That has never happened before in the history of imperialism. It's an amazing popular uprising, and it was coming right from mainstream America, from evangelical churches in the Midwest, all over the country. I mean, I spoke in churches in Kansas where people knew more about Central America than in the urban centers because they were going up and back and living with the people. This is almost totally, there's no discussion of this in the United States. It's a much too dangerous phenomenon. The idea that people on the ground can work together in solidarity is a very frightening idea in elite circles. So you don't talk about it, you don't find it in history, but people know it in their lives. Participants know it, many are continuing. This can be developed in other areas too. It's not easy. As I say, this example that I mentioned is unique in the history of imperialism. French citizens never went to live in Algerian villages when France was exterminating the population of Algeria. Americans didn't go live in Vietnamese villages when the United States was wiping out Indochina. Britain never did it in its colonies. It's happened once, can happen again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that remarkable example. I see two sets of questions. One is continuing this discussion of solidarity, and the other one about the new administration in the US. So the first one says, I would like to ask, what do you think about the social popular movements like Black Lives Matter, Land Back movement, and environmental movement in the global north and the Kurdish freedom movement can learn from each other, and how their struggles can contribute to the fight against rising authoritarianism around the globe, and to fend off the disastrous picture you draw that's impending due to the environmental and nuclear crisis. And the second set of questions is about, what does Professor Chomsky think about the Biden administration's approach to Turkey and Rojava? Do you think Biden will recognize the autonomous administration in Rojava? In a similar question, if the attack on the US Capitol and Biden-Harris taking over Trump's administration are going to change anything, is it going to be the same status quo, or is it going to have any implication on the US foreign policy?
Well, let me begin with the second question. It's a very important question and a hard question, and it has a very simple answer, like many hard questions. The answer depends entirely on whether popular activism and pressure will mount to compel the government, the Biden administration, to move in a more progressive direction. If that pressure does not take place, the Biden administration will move back to the centrist Clinton-Obama positions of creating a party that works for Wall Street, big donors, privileged professionals, and ignores the general population. That's what happened with Obama. Obama came into office with enormous popular support and enthusiasm. He had literally hundreds of thousands of young people working for him, helping for the election. They trusted him. They believed him. They believed the pleasant rhetoric. As soon as he was elected, he disbanded them, told them to go home. Don't worry, I'll take care of it. And he took care of it by betraying them and betraying the working class immediately. It was in the middle of a deep recession, financial crisis. There was Congress passed legislation to help the victims of the financial crisis. Had two parts. One part was to pay off the perpetrators of the crisis, the banks, the financial institutions who had carried out destructive, predatory, criminal lending practices which led to the crisis. So one part of the legislation was bail them out, put them back into business. The second part of the legislation was help the victims of the crisis, the people who had lost their homes, who had lost their jobs, offer them support and sustenance. One part of the legislation was implemented, the first part. Give the rich and powerful, pay them off. For the victims, nothing. That was understood. Within 2 years, Obama had lost the general population. 2 years later, congressional elections went against him. The pretty soon you had Trump, you know. Now, if that happens again, the same thing will happen. But it doesn't have to happen. There's a very substantial activist popular movement which already has pressed the Biden administration considerably towards the progressive side. So it's not perfect, but its environmental program is much better than any that preceded. It won't stay there unless the pressure continues. To the answer to the question of prediction is, will the activist popular movements maintain the pressure, expand the pressure, make sure that the government is compelled to move towards the steps that must be taken for bringing the country even into the civilized world. You have to take a careful look at what's happening in the United States. About the farthest left that you find is the Bernie Sanders movement. Very important, powerful, popular movement. Changed a lot of things. But what it's calling for is so mild that by world standards, it's almost laughable. And the main demand of the whole Sanders movement is universal health care. That's everywhere in the world. Mexico, Europe, Brazil, can't find a place that doesn't have it. That's the main demand, the most radical demand. The United States is very rich and powerful, very free, many very positive aspects, but in terms of social justice, it's deeply retarded. It's way at the bottom of the OECD countries, ranks alongside of Turkey, which is outlandish when you consider its wealth. So there are major changes that have to be taking place. And whether they will, we don't know. That leads to the first question. The George Floyd, Black Lives Matter demonstrations. They reveal the great power that lies in the hands of the general population. The Black Lives Matter movement has had quite astonishing success. It's a popular movement calling for overcoming one of the two great crimes of American history. American history is based on two enormous crimes. One is virtual extermination of the indigenous population. Only scattered remnants last. The second is the most vicious system of slavery in human history, which was produced cotton, which was the basis for the Industrial Revolution. Remember that cotton was the oil of the 19th century, and the wealth of the United States, Britain, France, others, relies very heavily on the slave production of cheap cotton. That remains, that never ended. The residue continues, and the Black Lives Matter movement is addressing it. And it's gaining very substantial support. After George Floyd was murdered, there was an enormous outpouring of support and activism, demonstrations all over, solidarity demonstrations in Europe, enormous popular support. They had about 2/3 of the population supporting them, which is unheard of for a social movement. It's far more than Martin Luther King had at the peak of his popularity. And it didn't happen just like that. It happened as a result of years of organizing and activism on the ground. That's how things develop. Lay the basis in the active organizing and education on the ground. When a moment comes that's sparks the light, like the suicide of the vendor in Tunis, the murder of George Floyd, then the pent-up understanding and emotions break out. And what that shows is that popular movements, if they persist organized, if they're committed and diligent, can achieve a great deal.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that inspirational answer about popular movements. And we're gonna end with one final question from Sardar Saadi, who will raise it himself. I thank you very much for all the answers.
Thank you so much, Professor Göner. This question comes from the room in Rojava, and Professor Chomsky. They demand that as soon as the pandemic is over and the roads are open, they want you in person in that room. They want you to be there. They want to host you. And the question is that given that the Rojava administration is currently fighting against many enemies in the region, what kind of principles they should take in order to build their relationships with the Biden administration, with the United States government. What sort of relationship do you see that Rojava administration could possibly take? And I know we are over time, but if you briefly could answer that, that would be great.
Well, I think there's another aspect to that question which should not be overlooked. What actions should be taken to generate solidarity and activism among the general public? With the Biden administration, they'll be like any other government. They'll support the interests of power and wealth unless they're pushed. That's the way governments behave. We should have no illusions about that. So they may make some pretty words, but I don't expect them to be as savage as the Trump administration. I don't think they'll tell Turkey, go invade and kill anybody you want, the way the Trump administration did. But they're not going to be helpful unless they're pressured by a public. That can succeed. It had effects in Central America, had effects in Indochina, can have effects in this case too. So I think what Rojava should be doing is trying under these horrible circumstances to continue doing what in fact it has miraculously done, provided a model of civilized, decent, progressive development, rights of women, civil rights, very hard, especially under these circumstances, but that's the only way to proceed. Take the values that you profess, live by them, exhibit them, show them to the world, and then the task is in the hands of people like me and others overseas to react positively. And that is not impossible. It's happened before. It led to the overthrow of the apartheid regime in South Africa, for example, after many, many years, many struggles, but it did finally happen. And it's happened in other cases. I think that's the only hope.
Thank you so very much, Professor Chomsky. We are very grateful that you accepted to inaugurate our annual lecture series. And also thank you, Professor Göner, for moderating discussions. I would also like to extend our thanks to Jalil Kaya, who took on the interpretation work of this lecture, to the poster designer of the lecture, who unfortunately has to remain anonymous, and to all of those who helped us to organize this lecture. Before ending today's lecture, I would like to inform you that our institute intends to organize workshops and panels in future. And in fact, the first workshop will take place in 2 weeks on February 1st. And this workshop entitled Fieldwork in Kurdistan, Navigating Obstacles and Future Opportunities, which is organized by Dr. Axel Rudi. Please follow the university's Facebook and or Twitter page for more details. We will also email the announcement today to the Institute's Google Mail group and to the Kurdish Studies Network. Please email us at ssinstitute@rojavauni.com if you'd like to be on our email listserv. And once again, the video of this lecture will be uploaded with Kurdish Kermanji subtitles and Kurdish Sorani subtitles very soon. I know many of you couldn't join the meeting. There were like some technical difficulties. My apologies for that. This is the first time that we are trying this live event with all of its complications, but I hope you enjoyed Professor Chomsky's lecture. And with that, we come to the end of the our program today. Have a wonderful weekend and stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.